361 of us currently together here. So I see Donya and Jill and others. This is fantastic. So the intent of this question is twofold. One, it's to celebrate the fact that we are all aging. So if you take one thing away from our time together this afternoon, I hope you take this with you, that this is about all of us. This isn't about some separate social group that we will never be a part of or aren't a part of, that this is about all of us. We all have a stake in being engaged, and we all have the ability to contribute to the movement to reframe aging. Which leads me into sharing a little bit more with you about the National Center to Reframe Aging. So on the next slide here, we have kind of three buckets in which we talk about our work. And the National Center is dedicated to ending ageism, a big and lofty goal, but we do that by advancing an equitable and complete story about aging in America, using proven communication strategies and tools to effectively frame aging issues. We are the nation's leading organization cultivating an active movement of individuals like yourselves, organizations, networks, collective impact groups, you name it, to really come together and build awareness of the implicit bias against older people and work together to influence policies and programs that benefit us all as we age. The National Center is led by the Gerontological Society of America on behalf of 10 national leading aging organizations. And on the next slide, you'll get to see those organizations. I am confident that you all recognize at least one of the logos on this slide, NCOA. But these organizations, the leaders came together about 10 years ago and said, we all have different vantage points in this field. We are all advancing age-inclusive policy and program work from a variety of different perspectives, and we all share this common barrier of ageism as we do that work. And how can we move the public? How can we move our work beyond that barrier so folks really understand the importance of age-inclusive policy and really embrace the idea that we are all aging every day? And that is the origin story of the National Center and what led to the research in which the National Center is based. We work with philanthropic partners at both a national and local level. And on the next slide, you'll see the four foundations that support the National Center at a national level. As I mentioned, we also work with local organizations, local foundations who are supporting their movement to reframe aging at a state and a regional level. I did mention that this work is research-based. All those years ago, we commissioned the Frameworks Institute to conduct this research, really understanding how can we, as the Aging Network, more effectively communicate about the issues we care deeply about, which is the work that the Frameworks Institute does. I encourage you all to explore more of their topic areas on their website. And as Diane catches up with us on the slides, I'll tell you a little bit more about the Gerontological Society of America. GSA was founded in 1945 and is a professional membership society that represents the experts in the aging field. We have more than 5,000 members who study all aspects of aging, everywhere from the biology of aging to social issues, policy issues, housing, retirement, you name it. We have a member that likely studies it. And these members come from these 26 different fields of study. And what's unique about GSA is that they're looking at aging issues across the entire lifespan, because as we know, decisions made early in one's life can have a major impact on our later years. And Diane, I see you're catching up with us on the slide. So we are now just one slide next. Yes, thank you so much. And if you can go back to the definition of ageism, I think it's really important for us, as Diane kind of set us in our context of this conversation, for us also to be working from a shared definition of ageism and what I mean when I say that. So the National Center, we use the World Health Organization definition of ageism, which defines it existing in several forms and on multiple levels. So we see ageism show up in stereotypes, prejudice, discrimination. We also see it showing up in multiple levels, on an interpersonal level, which might sound like someone saying, "Oh, you look great for your age." Or we see compassionate ageism. So that's otherwise known as elder speak. The "oh honey," "oh sweetie," "our senior," that sort of language would be defined as compassionate ageism. We also see systemic and institutional ageism, which shows up in policies such as forced retirement ages. So, once you hit 72, you have to retire. Blanket statement. So that would be an example of systemic ageism. And then all of this works very powerfully to how we experience and then have self-directed ageism, which might show up when we say, "Oh, I'm too young to," or "I'm too old to," and how all of these messages influence our ageism that we direct inwards. And if you said, "Oh yeah, that sounds familiar. Oh, I've experienced that," you are not alone. Colleagues of ours from the University of Michigan National Poll on Healthy Aging surveyed folks, adults aged 50 to 80. And on the next slide, you'll see the results of the survey that they conducted. What they found is that 82% of people within that age demographic reported experiencing one or more forms of everyday ageism. 82%. And it might seem individually that, "Oh, this is a small incident," but think about the compounding effects that has on our life, and how frequently we're exposed and may be experiencing this ageism. And we see this in our everyday messages, right? How does this show up in our everyday lives? It results from the messages we see, the images we see, starting at a very early age. And on the next slide, we see some of those everyday messages as an example for us. It's the jokes we hear our parents tell. It's the jokes we see on social media or late night television shows, poking fun at age. It's the advertising that we digest, the products that promise to delay aging, that encourage you to get rid of the wrinkles, get rid of the gray hairs. It's the birthday cards we have access to, right? All of these work very powerfully in kind of getting under our skin and informing how we look at what it means to grow older and how we look at older people in our lives. So when we think about these everyday messages, just be thinking about where you're inundated with these messages. And again, starting at a very, very early age. And one of the things that makes ageism so sticky is this idea of implicit bias towards age. And on the next slide, we have a definition of implicit bias. And what is important here is what our research found is that simply being aware of our implicit bias has the ability to reduce ageism. So I'll take a break from speaking and encourage you, or Diane will share on the next slide a video from our Frame of Mind video series, which just provides a glimpse into what implicit bias is and the role that it plays in our life. Thanks, Diane.
Sometimes ageism, bias against older people, can be pretty obvious. But often, these prejudices are hidden, even from ourselves. Research has found that for most people, ageism is a cognitive hole, a topic where a lack of information challenges our ability to engage productively. Ageism can show up in seemingly harmless, even positive-sounding phrases. This is an expression of implicit bias. It works under the surface, automatically and unintentionally. Still, it can affect how all of us think, speak, and act. Research from the National Center to Reframe Aging and its research partner, the Frameworks Institute, has shown that this kind of unthinking prejudice can drive bad policies and hide many of the important and positive parts of the story of aging. So how do we address this hidden bias? First, we need to call it out sensitively when it comes up in conversation or even in the media. An open-ended response sets the stage for a mutually valuable exchange. Our communications should resemble the diversity of aging. We should tell stories that describe older people taking on a variety of activities with family and friends, while also utilizing assistive devices and supportive services. Most importantly, we should carefully frame our public materials and presentation. Lead with a value statement about justice and explain how ageism is holding us back. Don't forget to define ageism, as most people aren't familiar with the term. Recognize that most ageism is implicit, under the surface, so explain how it operates. And finally, offer solutions. Making implicit bias visible can change attitudes about aging, influence policies and programs, and help all of us live more active and meaningful lives as we get older. Find resources and get started today at reframingaging.org.
A little bit of a taste of what we're going to spend the rest of our time this afternoon talking about. So I invite you, as we move into talking about what is framing, how do we do that, what are some strategies we can use in our communications, to reflect on these 4 questions. Have you seen ageism? Have you experienced ageism? This one can be hard to reflect on, but have you perpetuated ageism? And then this last one is really what we're focused on today. What can we do about it? What are some actions we can take, strategies we can employ to start to address this and shift culture around this? So I'm going to launch a poll here as we talk through our next slide. And that is to ask you a little bit more about the role that you play within your work. So I already see that we have some senior center directors with us, advocates, nutrition, program activities coordinator. So keep responding to that. And Diane, if you can go to the next poll or the next slide. So in your work as a grant writer, as a senior center director, as a programs activities coordinator, you have a role, you have influence in your professional work, you have influence in your personal work that has ripple effects that can advance the movement to reframe aging. And so be thinking as we go through today during your time with me, but also when we hear from Donia and Claire about what can you do to contribute to this ecosystem, because we all have a role to play and our work is interconnected and supportive of each other. So be carrying with you the question of what can I be doing? What influence do I have, and how can I be contributing to this work? So I'll go ahead and end the poll as we continue on to really talking about and understanding what framing is on the next slide. And go ahead and advance to there, Diane. So again, thinking about when I say reframing, what do I mean by that? What is that? And why is it so important? So framing is all about choices. And on the next slide, we'll see what those choices are. It's this idea that we are all communicators, whether you have the big C communicator title or not, whether that was the option you selected in that last poll we shared or not. You are communicating with clients, you are communicating with colleagues, you are communicating with policymakers, you are advocating in your community. In all of these roles and all of these capacities and all of the different forms of communication those interactions might take on, you are making choices of what to emphasize, how to explain something, and what to leave unsaid. Most of the time we're doing this unconsciously. We're just making those decisions, right? I think about how I do this if I'm advocating for a certain trip that I want to take with a friend, right? I'm going to choose what to emphasize, things that I know they would really enjoy. I'm going to choose what to explain, how beautiful it might be where we're going, how many fun different activities they have. And I might choose things to leave left unsaid, right? How expensive it might be to get there, or how long the car ride might be to get to that destination. Most of the time we're doing that unconsciously. And framing is all about making those decisions strategically, understanding the terrain that we're working within, the public understanding that we're working within, and how do we navigate through that strategically. And what happens is when we do this well, on the next slide, we'll see that people start to model our communications, which leads to discourse shifting and changing, which leads to people thinking just slightly differently, and ultimately leads to what we're looking for is increased policy and program support for all of us as we age. So when we have not saying the same exact thing, but using the same strategies in our work, this is what we start to see happen. And this is so important when it comes to aging because of the difference that exists between us as experts in the field and what the public thinks of when we ask them some core questions about what it means to grow older. So on the next slide, Diane, we see this difference. So one of the first steps in the research that was done was to understand what is the gap that exists between folks who want and respond to the question of how should we approach aging. An aging expert, we are more likely to say that aging is something we're all doing. It's something we should embrace, right? Just think back to all of those happy party emojis that we used just a few minutes ago in the chat. That is more often our default. For the public, based on those everyday messages that we're inundated with, right, the default is more likely that aging is a battle, right? Something I should work against, fight against, get the anti-aging cream because I want to delay it as much as possible, right? Again, these are just the defaults that exist. When asked the question of what can be done to ensure well-being in older age, we, and you all know well, right? It's the work you do every single day with your senior center. There is plenty that can be done to ensure well-being in older age. That is what all of your programs are about. Right? But for the public, it's seen as, well, there's really nothing we can do. What you reap is what you sow, hands up, and there's a very fatalistic sense about what can be done to ensure well-being. So this is what the dichotomy that exists between these two groups. And what Reframing Aging is all about is how do we bring more people into that productive, more holistic, complete understanding of what it means to grow older. And kind of move them away from a more fatalistic understanding of that. And this gap that we see is a primary reason that framing matters. It's because it contributes to what we call a you say, they think problem. So an example of this is on the next slide. It's when we as an expert might put out a message using something like the elderly to describe someone, right? And when we use that term, we have the context of our work, what we do every single day. We're imagining someone who is actively engaged in their community, who has a lot of experience and wisdom to offer, is contributing, right? That is the person that we're imagining. And we check our message with our colleague. It makes perfect sense to us. But when we put it out into the public, it somehow elicits a different response. So using the example of the elderly, for the public, someone who doesn't have the benefit of being in our context all of the time, their default would be thinking of someone who's probably frail, probably dependent on someone else, and is disengaged from community life. So you can see the difference that exists between these two, and what we need to be aware of the messages and the context that the public has when we're communicating with them. On the next slide, this is something I think that's of particular interest to a senior center community. And that was research that was done on the labels that we use when referring to older people. So this was a small portion of the research, but has some really interesting insights. And what researchers did was they had two scales. So they had all of these different labels, and they surveyed folks, a representative sample of the public, to say, when I use the label senior, when I use the label older adult, what is the rough estimate of age you would assign to that person? And you can see here what the averages were when they surveyed on those labels. Then the other scale that was used was what's your perceived competency of that person when it relates to things like digital competency, right? So they looked at different scales of competency. How competent would you assume that person is in these different areas? And what we see is when they look at the two, what became the recommendation was older person, older individual, older American, older fill in the Pennsylvanian, whatever your state might be, because it gets us roughly to the right age that we're all generally speaking about 60, 65 plus, and generally gets someone to think of someone who's more competent. So it's a small piece of the research, but gives you some insight into some of the different experiments that were used in this process. And that leads us well into talking about public understanding. So what the research really was aimed at was how can we better understand these deeply rooted ways that we have of thinking about older people, that we have about aging generally, and how then can we as advocates in the field use that information to navigate through these patterns of thinking that are harmful to our message, that don't help us get to that productive understanding of aging, and what are patterns of thinking that exist that might be more recessive but are helpful to our message. So on the next slide, we see how we've bucketed these into two groups. One are those traps to avoid. Again, these are patterns of thinking that exist that dominate the public's understanding of aging, that are ultimately harmful to the message that we're trying to communicate. And then the blue are strategies to advance. These are patterns of thinking that the public has. They're just more recessive. And what we need to do is figure out what strategies can we employ to cue those productive ways of thinking and avoid and navigate through the traps. And when we have much more time, we go into a lot of depth into each one of these buckets, but we're going to take a quick glimpse at each one of them, or at a few of them today. So on the next slide is our first trap that I want to talk about, and that is individualism. One of the most dominant patterns of thinking in aging and other areas is this idea of individualism. It's the concept that the outcomes, the results we experience in life are primarily or exclusively the results of good or bad personal choices. It's the grit, will, drive that we have chosen or not chosen to apply to our lives. And when we apply this individualistic thinking to aging, what the public reasons is that someone's ability to age well is exclusively determined by the personal, financial, lifestyle, and health choices that they have made. All very important, right? We need to be making good choices throughout our life. But what it does is that it obscures the ability for us to talk about the fact that context matters. You know, do you have a grocery store in your community? Do you have a senior center in your community that's helping provide transportation to get to medical appointments? What are these social supports that exist in our community that is helping that person live independently, right? And so when we think about how this individualism trap creates challenges in our messages, it's this idea that that individualism leaves the fact that context matters out of play, right? That the places we live, the supports we have are vital in determining our well-being. The next trap that we run into in our messaging is us versus them. As we've discussed in the US, the public holds a predominantly negative view of aging, which we see as we identify older people as a separate social group. And we frequently do that by using they and them language when referring to older people. And what happens is when we separate ourselves from this demographic group, it's easier to apply zero-sum logic thinking, which is this idea that more for you and yours necessarily means losses for me and mine. So the public reasons that when we support older people, that necessarily means losses for some other group. And we see this reinforced with, again, those everyday messages we're inundated with. And I invite you to see this as one of the traps that is kind of a low-hanging fruit to correct, right? Just changing the pronouns we use in our messages. So, for example, instead of saying, as they age, older people experience, fill in the blank, we can shift that sentence to say, as we age, we experience, fill in the blank. And you could feel the difference of how that might invite your reader, your audience, to see themselves as part of the solution and have a stake in paying attention and being engaged. The next trap that we're confronted with and need to learn how to navigate around is this ideal versus perceived real understanding. And this is the idea that the public holds two very contradictory views of aging. We have the idealized vision, which encompasses things like accumulated wisdom, self-sufficiency, an active lifestyle, earned leisure. This is when people are picturing the older person who's retired, kicking their feet up, relaxing on a beach somewhere, right? So we have this idealized vision of aging. And this differs greatly from what people presume to be the reality of aging, which is this inevitable process of deterioration, loss of control, and dependency. And this might show up when we hear people say, or when we think, oh, I don't want to get old. So that just means I'm going to have a bunch of health issues and I won't be able to take care of myself. And so you can see that the public has these very contradictory views and is unable to see that there's a lot of diversity in the aging experience. And when you've met one older person, you've met one older person, right? And so this trap really gets in the way of being able to see the heterogeneity as we age. And relies on, and frequently will cue that individualism too, that both patterns are extremely individualistic because they're seen as a result of the individual decision making that you've applied throughout your life. The last trap I want to talk about is how the public looks at solutions. So we are extremely fatalistic when we think about the prospect of aging and the ability to thrive in older age. And in our messages, we cue this fatalistic thinking in a couple of different ways. A primary way is how we label and talk about demographic change. So you'll see characterizations such as silver tsunami, demographic cliff, demographic crisis, impending social crisis, starting a message with big statistics, all of which we know demographic change is real, but when we begin that way, it can really scare our listener off from wanting to be engaged. This is just too big of a problem. I can't do anything about a tsunami coming after me. My only solution is to run. And that's what happens when we characterize demographic change with fatalistic language. It also is what happens when we start with really big, scary statistics, which we intend to build urgency, but which actually just, again, scares people off from wanting to be engaged and really thinking about the policy systemic level solutions that we want to advocate for. We need to continue to support the transportation system that helps older people in my community get from their home to a medical appointment or from their home to a senior center to be engaged in programming. So we've gone through some of these traps, and now we're going to do a brief quiz to see if you all can help me identify where these traps show up in messages. Thanks for advancing this slide. So this is an example of a message. I'm going to launch a poll here in a few moments, and as I read through this example, you can select all of the traps that you see showing up here in this message. So let me go ahead and launch this poll. And again, as I read it, you can select as many of the traps that you see show up as I read. So by 2030, adults 65 years and older will make up nearly 25% of Ohio's population, up from 14% today. This dramatic change in lifespan is a cause for both celebration and concern. The massive numbers of the oldest old will unleash a torrent of Medicaid spending that threatens the state treasury. The burden falls to Medicaid because many individuals deplete their assets to pay for long-term care that Medicare doesn't cover. Okay, so I'm seeing some answers here in the chat. I'm gonna let it process here for a moment. And Diane, if we go to the next slide, we can look at the answers that we have. So you all, many people have answered us versus them, which is right on. We see that they and them language that exists here. We also see the fatalism, the solutions, fatalistic thinking towards solutions that exists when we use this crisis language at the start, right? By 2030. Again, an important statistic that might help underscore our point, but we don't need to lead with that because it can scare folks off. We also see language such as torrent, right? And unleash a torrent or massive numbers. So you all nailed it in identifying these three chapters: individualism, us versus them, and fatalism. So thank you all for participating in our poll. I will go ahead and end that as we move in to our next slide. So we've talked about these traps. Again, these are patterns of thinking that exist that we need to learn how to navigate through, how to navigate around. And we have strategies we can use to do that. So this is an overview of those strategies, and we're going to go in one by one and look at some examples as we do that. So the first strategy we have is to talk about the process of aging as building momentum. This is the idea that as we age, we gain experience, we gain wisdom, and we can use that to power up our communities. And that's the concept of building momentum. Right? As we age, we build momentum. And you can hear the energy that's behind that statement. I love this example that we have of the bus. This is from colleagues at Age Strong Boston, who had an opportunity to rebrand this important transportation resource in their community. So for years, it was referred to as a senior shuttle, which is very accurate to the service that it provided. And when they rebranded, instead of referring to it as a senior shuttle, on the side in that small print there, it says transporting Boston's most experienced people. Now, I invite you to consider you're standing on the corner waiting for one of these buses. They both pull up. Which one do you want to get on? If I was there, I would be choosing, yes, I see bus 2. Thank you, Ruben. I agree. I would be wanting to get on that blue bus. And you can see how that has an impact of the person who's utilizing that service, who's getting on the bus, but then also think about the ripple effects that has as it passes through Boston and passes by all of the Bostonians in that split second, how that might impact how someone views someone utilizing that transportation service. So a great example of not going out into the world and saying, hey, I'm reframing aging, but doing it really, really well. The next strategy we have available to us is to explain the supports we need to live meaningful lives as we age. And it's really important here to be specific, help people imagine what that is, and communicate the idea that we all rely on community supports throughout our life, right? And so the example that we have here that we point to is the curb cut effect. You may have heard of this. Curb cuts was an infrastructure change that happened inspired by someone who uses a wheelchair and then required by the Americans with Disability Act. And you can see how it benefits the person utilizing a wheelchair, but how it also benefits the family that's pushing a stroller, the delivery person that's pulling a dolly, the little kid that's using a bike or a scooter to get around, me when I have a suitcase and I'm headed somewhere with a suitcase that supports me. So it's important when we talk about the supports we need to really highlight how this benefits us all, and really cue that it helps steer away from the individualistic way of thinking and cue that idea that we all rely on social and community supports. The next strategy that we have is to talk about frailty without relying on paternalism. When we are telling the complete story of aging, we acknowledge that frailty is part of that story, can be part of that story. However, we have the ability to talk about that experience, emphasizing the idea that what surrounds us shapes us. So here is an example of talking about frailty while relying on the us versus them and some paternalistic language, and talking about older people who are frail, vulnerable, cannot help themselves, leave them at risk for all sorts of challenges, potential harms, and scams. And then on the next slide, we see the reframed example, which really puts the emphasis on the idea that what surrounds us shapes us, right? So when community bonds are weak, older people who are frail are more at risk of experiencing harm. We need to build solid connections and strengthen our social structure to better support older people, family, caregivers, and our entire community. So you can really see how that shifts to thinking about how this is about all of us. This is about our community. This is about strengthening our community. And what we need to do to contribute to that. The next strategy we have is to talk about ageism as a problem that can be solved. So as we've mentioned, the public is extremely fatalistic when thinking about what can be done to address issues like ageism. And when we see ageism, as the video reminded us, we need to call it out. We need to find a way of doing that calls people in and asks and invites more questions. And one way we can do that is by offering different ways of talking about aging. So here are some signs that come from us, from one of our facilitators who is in Worthington, Ohio. And as part of their age-friendly work, they came up with these different signs that are posted in their town square. It's a high traffic area that people in their community are passing by on a frequent basis. And you can see it gives an alternative to the language we frequently hear about aging and talks about aging in a much more productive, positive way. So you see that aging so cool that everyone's doing it, which the origin story of that saying is also on our website. So I encourage you to look at that. Engage at every age, be thankful for the gift of age. Again, it's just an alternative way of talking about aging, giving people different language to use and encouraging them and looking for them to model that in their work. And then finally is our strategy is really talking about and highlighting innovative and creative solutions. And this, again, really gets us to think about how we talk about the solutions that we have. So when we are communicating, we need to keep our end game in mind. We need to start with the solution instead of those statistics. Start by talking about this is the change we can see. This is the program that will help support our community. And then walk people through why that's needed. And what this does for our message is it really helps people see possibilities. It prompts that can-do spirit, helps us navigate around and is an anecdote for the fatalistic thinking that nothing can be done. And when framed well, when we talk about these concrete, specific, credible solutions that people can imagine, it also helps us highlight the collective benefit and really emphasize that thought that what surrounds us shapes us. And that helps us avoid the trap of individualism. So again, when we present solutions, we want people to be able to imagine that. Imagine the intergenerational program that's happening, what that looks like, that is totally possible, something I can support, something I can be a part of, I can be engaged in, and help draw that through to avoid these traps and, again, highlight the solutions. As we talk about solutions, again, I will, here on this slide, and Alicia will put the link in the chat for us, is a link to some of the solutions our partners have had. So these are folks who have been trained in reframing aging, and the principles to reframe aging, have applied it to their work, and some of the wins that they're receiving. I have highlighted here the Connecticut story, which you'll hear from Claire in just a few moments about the work that she's doing in Connecticut and what that looks like, the impact that that has. So you can read a glimpse of that or take it as a follow along after you hear Claire speak. And again, just a reminder of what happens when a framework. So on the next slide, Diane, we see what the research shows us in terms of what happens when a frame works. And what we see, what the research showed, was that knowledge about aging increases, attitudes towards aging improves, and policy and program support grows, which again, that last piece is really what we're after. We want to ensure people know that there's plenty that can be done to ensure well-being in older age and that they can be a part of that solution. So as you go forth and reframe and take that one piece that you're going to take with you, that one nugget of wisdom you're going to share with someone else, you are not alone. We have resources from the National Center that are there to help you. There's a quick start guide, which just gives you your first base, right, of here are some things I can stop doing and here are some things I can try to start doing. We have an online learning center, very similar to the NCOA Connect, that goes a little bit deeper into some of these topic areas. We have a bi-monthly newsletter that goes directly to your inbox, gives you insights into what's happening around the country to advance this work. And then Alicia had already shared the link to our Frame of Mind video series, which gives you 2.5 minute glimpses into the principles to reframe aging. So the National Center is here to provide you support as a strategic partner, as you can figure out what would this look like in my local community, can offer technical assistance, education, and keep you connected to this growing movement of folks around the country who are dedicated to ending ageism by advancing this more productive way of thinking about aging. And this last slide for you is just a reminder that this is a generation's work, right? This isn't going to happen overnight, but each small step that we take advances the work and is critically important. And we know that when we're able to see success here, that having those productive perceptions of aging are priceless. So please join in the conversation online, reach out to myself or to one of our other National Center team members, and we'd love to connect with you and help you contribute to this movement. And with that, Diane, I will pass the mic back to you, and we may have 1 or 2 minutes for questions before we move on to our next session.
Thank you so much. So my video isn't starting right now, but I trust that you can hear my voice. And thank you for such a great presentation. I have seen presentations on reframing aging. The more I hear it, the more it sinks in, right? The more you start thinking about it and get refreshed about it. And it's so important for senior centers to kind of take this message. We did have some questions that were answered in the chat. One of them that I saw that I don't think we addressed is in the video and in some of the imaging. You use images of people in wheelchairs or people with walkers, and the question was why are you using those? So I guess it's, do they promote an image of frailty?
Oh no, well, and that's an excellent question. I think I would say it's important to highlight that assistive devices aren't always an image of frailty. It helps people navigate through their community. Right? So we want to make sure that we're promoting images of older people, and Donia will speak to this this afternoon too, the images that we use being a powerful descriptor, really saying there's great diversity in the aging experience. There's people who need assistive devices, there's people that don't, and we need to make sure that what we're advocating for is inclusive of everybody. And I think it's also helpful to note that we want to be a strong kind of framing partner to the folks in the ableism community and supporting the work that they're doing and highlighting people using assistive devices that help them stay engaged and be engaged in community is an important piece of that work.
Thank you. So for everybody watching, we're getting ready to move into our second session, and appreciate that there's not a lot of time in between. You did get the second link when you got an email with the first link. If you can't find it, the long URL is right here. You should be able to access it from where you registered for the first one. And as an added bonus, in the third session, which is our roundtables, Hannah will also be there. So if you have questions that come up between now and then, we do have another kick at the can at asking Hannah or our other panelists questions. But for now, thank you very much for attending the first session. We look forward to seeing you in our second session. Hannah, as always, thank you.